Have you ever been in a situation where someone is making you doubt your own reality or you don't really trust your own brain to know what's real and what isn't real? Well, you may be being gaslit, intentionally or unintentionally. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What is gaslighting and is it happening to me? Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Amelia Kelley. Dr. Kelley is a trauma informed therapist, author, podcaster, and researcher. Her specialties include art therapy, internal family systems, EMDR, and brain spotting. Her work focuses on women's issues, empowering survivors of abuse and relationship trauma. She is the author of Gaslighting Recovery for Women, the complete guide to recognizing manipulation and achieving freedom from emotional abuse. We're going to talk a little bit today about what gaslighting is, what gaslighting isn't, some examples of gaslighting in romantic relationships, but also just in society, in our everyday world. This is a really interesting episode where we really touch on a lot of important things to do with gaslighting. And I hope it helps you in potentially recognizing if this is happening or has happened in the past. So, welcome to this episode. And of course, with all of the Rebel Love, Let Love Begin episodes, take what works for you and leave what doesn't. This is Let Love Begin, a podcast for the recovering brokenhearted, ready to heal and reclaim their enthusiasm. Well, hey there, it's Talia here, and I wanted to take a quick break to let you know that I started this podcast when I went through my most significant breakup. And what really helped me at the time was listening to other people's stories of healing and how they transformed through their breakup. That really helped me understand what I was going through and really gave me hope that I could get there too. Before this podcast, I created an online summit where I interviewed 21 experts talking about different aspects of breakups and how we can let go of our ex and begin to open our hearts again. It's called the Let Love Begin Summit. And if you're interested in watching or listening to the summit, you can go to rebellove.com/summit and use the code podcast for 20% off. It's usually just $21, which is $1 per interview, but you can get it for around 16-ish using the code podcast. I hope you get as much out of it as I got making it. Okay, back to the episode. So welcome, Dr. Amelia Kelley. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Me too. I'm really excited to talk
Mhm.
about this. I'm excited to talk about this. And what we're talking about today is gaslighting. What is it? And is it happening to me? And I'm excited to talk about it because we hear this term thrown around so often. You know, at one point I was like, what is this? What is this thing that everyone's talking about? This was years ago now. And then I Googled it, got the definition, and then I was like, this doesn't seem to be how it's being used. So
Mm,
can you give us a definition of what gaslighting is?
I'd love to. So, gaslighting is a form of emotional manipulation and abuse. And I'm sure we'll unpack why it's abuse. And it is intended to confuse or throw someone off, make them question their inner ego, their inner strength, their inner stories. And it can really have an overall impact on just your general sense of the world around you and your experiences. So I think it's an interesting thing to define because it's such a confusing experience that the definition is the base of it, and then we have to unpack it.
Why is it considered abuse?
So gaslighting is intended to really overpower another person. I mean, the reason oftentimes why someone would gaslight is because they don't want to lose control, whether it be within a relationship, within an organization, within a group. I mean, you can even think of gender based gaslighting or racialized gaslighting, where there's a group of people that don't want to lose the power that they believe they have. And so it's a tactic meant to harm the other person. And it's in this camp of these abuse tactics that don't leave bruises, so to speak, but do leave lasting impact on our brains and how we interact with the world and what we think and what we feel. And so the intention is to harm.
Do people always know that they are intentionally gaslighting somebody else?
I love that question because there's been something that's happened in all of these conversations. I think anytime you explore something deeply enough, you're going to talk to new people and get new perspectives. And I was having a really excellent conversation about this with someone about the fact that there is most likely, in my opinion, subconscious gaslighting. and this is not a term that's out there. I think I'm going to coin it. But subconscious gaslighting that can happen maybe when you're not trying to overrule or control or overtake someone, but you feel threatened, you feel fear, you feel insecurity. And so you may be likely to deny your part in something or not want to take responsibility or confuse dynamics or things that happened. The difference, however, in my opinion, with this kind of subconscious gaslighting is that when it is brought to your attention, you will hopefully, in that case, be willing to own it, to do something about it, to work with it. It kind of makes me think of my husband and I. If I'm feeling ignored over a period of time, and maybe I might say something like, "You never pay attention to me." I mean, technically, that's untrue. And it could be kind of a form of gaslighting. If I wanted to double down and really try to warp our whole relationship in my favor and control him and really take it to the next level, that could become a gaslighting type statement. Or if it's brought to my attention and then I take a moment to reflect, I do believe there's a way to work through that. But gaslighting as an action, as a whole, as an abuse tactic, usually is coupled with someone not willing to take ownership,
Right.
not willing to change, to express remorse, to apologize, to change course. That's, I think, the distinction.
Right, because I was gonna say what I was thinking when you're saying that was it takes quite an aware person to own things, and I think not just with gaslighting, with anything, when something's brought to our attention, there's that initial sting of like, "Ugh," for me, it's like,
Mhm.
is this true what this person's saying? And
Mhm.
sometimes there's still that like, knee-jerk reaction of it hurts to be called out, especially in front of others. So it's,
Mhm.
even if the person calling you out does it in the best way, sometimes it always isn't received in that manner.
Mhm.
Again, I wonder if that's intentional or if they're really just so unaware that they
Mhm.
choose to acknowledge that this could even be a possibility.
Right. Are you talking about abusive gaslighting, or are you talking about when someone, as we've coined talking about it here, more subconscious, unconscious almost gaslighting? Which one are you referring to?
Yeah, I'm referring to the unconscious because the reason is
Mhm.
because if you're the person being gaslighted and someone is unconsciously doing it, Um, it'd be great to like talk about some tools that we could give our listeners on how we could lovingly call them out. Because if they are doing it unintentionally, and I think the reason why this is kind of so close to me is that I think this happened to me. I was severely gaslighted,
Mhm.
and it really messed with my sense of reality. And
Mhm.
I can talk about that in just a minute. But I really don't think that the person who did it really meant to do
Mhm.
it. But she
Mm.
really didn't realize what she was doing. But it really, really, really shook me for years. And I was like, I only think she got it a couple of years later when I was like,
Mhm.
I don't think you realize how severe that episode was. Like I really
Mm.
trusted you and you promised me to my face and you lied and it warped my reality in the state I was in at that time. And
Right.
yeah, and it was really I wouldn't have I think I would have never experienced how much it shook me
Mhm.
unless I experienced it. And I definitely
Mm.
know that she's not a malicious person and she's never done anything since or prior to that. And it was just immaturity, I think, at the time and not really
Mhm.
knowing the severity of the actions.
So I wonder with that situation, if you had brought it to her attention in that moment, do you think she would have do you know how she might have received it based on what you know now?
So I think at the time, first of all, I didn't know because I really
Mhm.
trusted her. I think I was in a very vulnerable state.
Mhm.
And I think that was the important part that I was in such a vulnerable state. And this, I felt really taken advantage of. But I didn't know until after because she'd assured me that she was telling me the truth. And I
Mhm.
was like, oh my God, I'm going crazy. Because she basically, the situation was, I can't remember exactly, but I remember the impact was I thought someone had come over, a certain person, and she was like, "Oh,
Mhm.
they did." And I was like, "No, they didn't." And she was like, "Yeah, they did." And then she kept telling me that they did and they didn't. And so I
Mm.
was like, "Oh my gosh, did they really?" I was like, "Oh my God, I'm so crazy. I don't remember that at all." Like it was
Mhm.
completely my mind's just blank. And she was
Mhm.
like adamant. And I said, hey, look me in the eye and tell me, like, you're really serious that that person came over. And she's like, they did. And so, and I was just like, I was like, whoa. And I was just like so floored after I realized that she'd been lying. And I didn't, I was just like, my head was spinning because like this whole part of our relationship crumbled in that moment. Cause I was like, wow,
The
I really
trust.
trust, yeah, I really trusted you.
Mhm.
And, it really did take years to rebuild. And I like, I love this person. She's like one of my best friends. And
Mhm.
I still love her to this day. We've got a great relationship and we've talked about it and unpacked it and all that stuff. So, in answer to your question, at the time, I don't think I could have called her out because I wasn't aware of it.
Mm.
Would she have taken it in a certain way? I don't think she would have because she didn't realize. She was like, oh, it's a joke. Stop taking it so seriously. And it's like, which I
Right.
think a lot of men do to women with misogyny. It's like, oh, it's just a
Mhm.
joke. Like, why are you taking it so
Right.
seriously? So as I say, that's
Mhm.
also really a form of gaslighting, isn't it? Really?
Right, the minimizing.
Yeah.
Minimizing your emotions is a very, very common and really sometimes hard to detect because it can be based on opinion. It can be based on prejudice. It can be based on past experiences. And if the person who is inflicting their misogyny, for example, as you're saying on you, is calling you overdramatic, then
Right.
it almost prevents the expression in the first place. Like, well, no, I need to express that you're gaslighting me, but I don't want to seem overdramatic. So it's like this feedback loop.
Yeah, well, there's a part of that you put in your book about women have always been labeled as suffering hysteria. That happens a lot. It's like, oh, she's just being hysterical. She's just being dramatic. She's just being a drama queen. And it's so insidious, even women say it about other women.
That's true. That's true. And we are not hyping the way we should be. We are not tapping into our inner Jamie Lee Curtis. I don't know if you know what I'm
Right.
referencing. Did you see that? It was like the photo of her when her co star won at the Golden Globes, and she was like wildly
Ecstatic.
excited. Yeah, yeah. So
It's so great to see women supporting other women, isn't it?
agreed, agreed.
Yeah.
With the situation with your friend, I'm curious, and I think it's a good example because it makes me think of the term gaslight actually came, even though this is a human behavior that has existed forever. It
Hmm.
was given a name in the, I want to say 1940s play out of England called Gaslight, which then was turned into a Hollywood film, which received Oscars and then was later adapted into, I wanna say, kind of pop psychology, which then now has made its way into the rooms of therapists. In that movie or in the play, the husband was making the wife think that she was going crazy by thinking that the gas lights in the house were dimming when
Right.
it was him doing it. He was trying to make her go insane, basically.
Right.
And I am not saying your friend is that man, but it kind of reminded me of
Right.
that a little bit.
Yeah.
So when she confronted her husband, he doubled down, denied, said you're crazy. So my
Right.
question was this, if at the time you knew about this and you had come to your friend and said, that was really messed up. That really almost felt traumatizing to me. How do you think she might have hypothetically responded?
I think in the moment, in the state we were in, she wouldn't have taken it seriously, but later
Mm,
on, she definitely did. She took it very seriously, and she apologized profusely, and also expressed deep regret for doing it. I think, and that's what made me realize is that she really didn't realize she was doing it, and I truly believe that, and that's why I was
mhm.
like asking you those questions of the what did you call it?
Subconscious gaslighting or
Subconscious
unconscious
gaslight.
gaslighting, something along those lines. We'll have to work on it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, yeah, she's a very different person now. So am I. We've both matured a lot. We've had
Mhm,
a lot of growth in our friendship, which has been really
mhm,
amazing. Yeah, it's really interesting going back to that story of the dimming the lights because the point is of a gaslighter, if in that instance the man he knew what he was doing, is to make you doubt your own mind, isn't it? It's to
mhm.
make you not trust
Absolutely,
yourself.
absolutely. To weaken, as I was saying, that own inner ego strength, self-esteem, confidence, and you can see how it feeds itself because if you're feeling insecure and then the person gaslights you, you will be less likely to call out the gaslighting behavior.
Right.
Not only because it can be difficult to detect sometimes, but also because that inner boundary setting is not in place in the first place.
Right. You're trusting their perspective on the world over your own. And
Yes.
the more they double down, the more you doubt yourself. It's not even the more you
Mhm.
trust them, it's the more you doubt yourself. And you're like, oh, I must not know. So therefore,
Mhm.
the default is that they must be right.
Well, and the interesting thing too is gaslighters, ones who are abusively gaslighting, want to be your sole purpose or your sole source of information. And sometimes they will work to isolate you. That because that is one of the, one of the power and control wheel behaviors of isolation. It makes gaslighting more effective because one of the most important ways to counteract gaslighting that I encourage in my book is checking in with other people that you trust about whether or not what you experienced is either real or realistic, or it giving you that touchstone with reality is very important.
But you can't do that if you're isolated. Right.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. And so you said trust. I think it's a really key point that that kind of is their goal. They want you to trust their perception. Even if there's that little inner voice that feels unsettled and doesn't think that you should trust them, if this person, and you can think of really big power dynamics, parents and children. That's a very, very imbalance of power. When there's a lot of imbalance of power, there can be a lot more opportunity for gaslighting.
Brings up a perfect segue into our next question. I think oftentimes we think about gaslighting more so in romantic relationships, but there's plenty other places in societies and relationships, such as parental and also medical. I was reading your book and I was like, it doesn't really come to mind straight away. And then you're like, oh, yeah, people place a lot of faith in doctors. So let's talk a little
Hmm.
bit about that. What are some stories that
Absolutely.
stand out to you in the medical arena around gaslighting?
Well, the term you used a couple minutes ago, hysteria, is a perfect example of this. Anytime there was any sort of medical complication or issue or mental health issue with a woman, especially when it dealt with any of the reproductive organs, it was deemed hysteria. And I mean, women would be locked away for something as simple as, really severe PMS.
Right.
So we fast forward to now, our research is behind. The research, unfortunately, up to this point, has been behind on a lot of medical diagnoses. A lot of the diagnosis or a lot of the treatments have been looked at white men,
Yeah.
honestly. And getting
Unsurprising.
enough diversity, getting enough gender diversity is so important. And you can look at also very misunderstood diagnoses such as endometriosis, fibromyalgia. These are these syndromes and these collection of different symptoms that are hard to peg sometimes, and
Mhm.
also happen to be a lot more common in women. So women are at greater risk of medical gaslighting. Also, individuals, people of color, are more marginalized and likely to be medically gaslit.
Mhm.
But a very simple example, imagine you're going into the doctor and you feel like you're having, to use menstrual cycle as an example, you feel like you're having really severe periods. And you could go to the doctor, express your concerns, and they can absolutely do all these different tactics to medically gaslight. They can minimize, they can deflect, they can say, maybe you should stop looking at Dr. Google. Why are you looking on the internet for your source? I am the source of information. We all need to respect that obviously there's only so much that you can really fully trust from the internet. We want to have it all taken in with a grain of salt. But at the end of the day, you are the expert of your medical experience. And if you feel that your doctor is not taking your concerns into account or disregarding them, you have a right to get a second opinion. You have a right to change providers. You have a right to ask for tests to be done. And if they're not being done, that is a sign that medical gaslighting could be happening to you.
Yeah, that's interesting actually. I've had that happen. And I just want
Really?
to Yeah, I want to quickly point out though that because in the States, you guys have insurance, right? So you would pay for all the tests. So I guess you can get
I'm
whatever tests
laughing
you
because
want.
it's a very faulty system, but yes.
Very, very right. But we most of the time the government pays for our tests. So
Okay.
they're a bit more, sometimes some doctors here, not all the time, but sometimes some doctors here can be like, well, I don't think that's medically necessary, so we're not going to pay for it, basically. Yeah, I've had that happen before with a few doctors, and I just go to another doctor because I'm like, I
Good for
want these
you.
tests done. And I just never go back to that doctor again. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think another important thing you can do to protect yourself too is to keep track of your symptoms. If you have something that you're concerned about, keeping a journal, keeping some sort of monitoring of what you're experiencing, because when you get into that dynamic where the power is kind of separated so much, it can be difficult to remember all the things that you wanted to bring up. I even have clients come in that sometimes forget what they wanted to talk about, and I
Right.
encourage them to jot that stuff down. And it also is something that can be used if you're being gaslit in relationships, because if you're experiencing things and you don't know up from down, it's not the worst thing ever to keep track of emails or texts or things that you are questioning. And in my book, I actually offer like a little workbook area where you can fact track things that you've experienced because it can help you to go back and really remind yourself what you're going through.
It's interesting actually. I was just having this flashback to a housemate when I lived in Canada, and I'm almost 100% sure she gaslit me because she would say I said these things, and I have memory problems because I had an injury, so my short-term memory is not as good as it used to be. And she would say
Mm,
things and I was like, I never said that. Like, and then
hmm.
she'd be so adamant that I said it. And she was
Mm.
such a more aggressive person than me. So I just like was like,
Oh,
I don't want to argue. So I just kind of let it go because I was like, I don't want to do this back and forth.
yeah.
But I was like, this never happened. Like I never said that. And so when is it like someone just misremembering versus manipulation?
And, I love that you brought that up because that is a good distinction if you're trying to determine, is this just human conflict? Because
Right.
that happens. Not everything is gaslighting.
Right.
Not every time that I disagree or that I feel a certain way or that I have a different opinion or, as you were saying, misremember something, is it gaslighting?
Right.
Um, so I think you just distinguished with her because it felt more manipulative because sometimes there's literal proof. You can have literal proof with a gaslighter. You can have receipts in your hand and a gaslighter will sometimes they will still deny. They will deny. Whereas someone who's misremembering, that's I mean, that could be a sign of just human conflict. It could be a toxic relationship. I mean, that's the one thing. You can have a toxic relationship or an unhealthy relationship and have it not be abusive. So that's important to remember also.
Hi there, this is Talia, and I'd like to make a request. If this episode resonated with you and you found value in our conversation, could you show your support by hitting the subscribe or follow button? It's a simple way to let the platforms and us know you appreciate this content. By following the podcast, you'll ensure you'll never miss out on an episode, and your support really means a lot to us. Thank you for being a part of our journey. In your book, you outlined 7 gaslighting tactics used by abusers. Can we
Mhm.
go over those tactics?
Well, I think one of the things that's really good to remember with those, and I'm going to disclose, those 7 are 7 of many
Right.
examples, truly. There are so many different ways that someone can gaslight, but a couple that I did outline just to kind of hit a couple that I don't think we've talked about yet, because
Hmm.
we have talked about quite a few. We talked about denial, talked about withholding. So, withholding information, displacing blame, not being willing to take responsibility, trivializing. That's one that I don't think we've touched on that I think can be a little bit more difficult to pinpoint. And that's where if you have an emotion or a thought or an idea, someone could even question whether your source is appropriate, whether
Hmm.
where you're getting your ideas from. You can be gaslit about for instance, your political beliefs or your religion or any of these kind of big arching things that really make you you. And so that's important too. It might not always look like just an outright lie or withholding information, but it can also look like trivializing, making fun, or degrading your opinion or how you feel about something. And I think that's when it's a little trickier to identify.
Right. When you were saying that, I was just like COVID just flashed into my brain.
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yeah, there were so many. I had some very strong-willed anti-vaxxer friends and then very strong-willed hardcore pro-vaxxer friends. And it was so tricky being in the middle of that because it was like you're both really aggressive in your own way. And
Mhm.
both are just completely disregarding and unwilling to listen to the other side. So
Mhm.
it wasn't a discussion, it wasn't a discourse, it was just a brute force kind of I'm right and this is what's happening kind of thing. And it was like
Mhm.
as a society, it's like, well, where do we go from there? And there's so much of that polarity now. Oh God. So how do we navigate this when it's everywhere?
Well, I think one of the big things you had said a little bit earlier, you were mentioning sometimes I just don't have the energy or the desire to, kind of contradict someone. I think it's important that we as a society learn how to compassionately and empathetically be more disagreeable. Being disagreeable is okay. Having your own individual emotional identity and ideas should be encouraged. And so
Hmm.
I think if we lean into a little bit more willingness to say what we prefer versus don't prefer and understand that being people pleasing or agreeable and having a lack of boundaries makes us much more susceptible to different forms of gaslighting. And you said, I love that you brought up society because, in essence, when we talk about the polarity with COVID, anti versus pro vax, I didn't hear that your friends were gaslighting each other, but I would really beg to differ that both of them, those two groups, were probably being gaslit on a societal level through news, through media, through messaging that they're receiving.
Hmm.
So sometimes being really aware, are you listening to only one side of a story or are you speaking with someone or digesting information that's more holistic and gives you different angles is very important.
Right. Yeah. My friend was just talking about that. Are you in an echo chamber? There's a lot of, conflict going on in the world at the moment. And it's really interesting. I have a friend and she's constantly playing devil's advocate. We've got very strong opinions about it. She's like, well, what about this? What about this? She's like, well, you should look at both sides. So I was like, okay, let me start following some accounts of the other side that I'm not agreeing with. And it's interesting. She's like, what do you think after following those other sides? And I'm like, it's even more reinforcing what I think. Like this is actually it's
Yeah.
making yeah, like it's good that I'm following it because it's so ridiculous and it is like I can't believe the level of propaganda that I'm seeing.
Well, and really, if you think about I was asked by someone, why do I think gaslighting became such a popular term?
Mhm.
And really, if you look at I'm looking at this as an American. If
Right.
I look at what happened, from about 2017 to 2020 some, we all know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But we had this collision course of very obvious political gaslighting happening. Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter movement, people coming out and saying, wait a minute, I have been gaslit for centuries, or I have been gaslit for years. I mean, all those women coming out in the Me Too movement most likely had been gaslit into silence up until that point.
Yeah, and minimized.
Minimized. Oh, no one's going to believe you. Why would
Yeah.
you say anything? No one's ever going to be charged. It's your word against their word. It's just trying to control those within a system if you think about it.
Yeah, push them down. It's interesting actually that you bring that up because when that whole happened, I was talking to my friend. A lot of women were discussing their experiences in
Mhm.
the world, and a lot of women were saying around me, "Oh, I don't feel like posting or saying anything because I feel like what happened to me wasn't that big of a deal."
Do you see?
Right? Yeah. And
Mhm.
so they were like,
Mhm.
"Well, I didn't get sexually assaulted." And then my other friend was like, "Well, it is sexual assault. It's just not, rape." So it's like it's
Right.
really interesting to see like even in ourselves going, "Well, that's not so bad." And then it's like, "Well, hang on, how would you feel if that was your daughter or your niece or your mother?" Like, is that okay for
Good
people to
point.
behave like that? How do we say, well, of course, this is inappropriate. It's really inappropriate. It's actually great. I'm watching Sex Education. I don't know if you've watched that show,
I
but
think I watched the first 2 seasons. Are there 3? I'm, like, missing a
four,
season. Oh,
four
there's 4.
season,
Okay, I'm missing
four,
a
yeah,
couple seasons, but I've
yeah.
watched some of it, yes.
Yeah, and there's a classic example on that. So a woman gets ejaculated on a bus, and she
Think I saw that.
yeah, and she just pushes it aside like it's not a big deal. She's holding a cake, so she doesn't really have her hands free.
Oh,
And
is
her
it
friend
the blonde one?
Amy, yeah.
Yes, okay, yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And her friend's like, we have to report this. And she's like, oh, it's not a big deal. It's fine,
Yes.
And she's like, no,
Mhm.
it's a big deal. Like this should not be happening on a bus. And I thought it was
Right.
such a great example showing like what's an appropriate way to deal with this kind of behavior because we minimize it. We say, women, oh, it's not a big deal because
Mhm.
a lot of women are so used to inappropriate behavior that it's
Mhm.
it's just like it's everywhere.
Right.
I wonder, is that a form of even gaslighting ourselves?
So there are focuses on self-gaslighting. Like, you can have this experience of doubting your own thoughts, your own questions, minimizing that kind of critical inner self-talk can be really strong. And I think it begins though with messaging that we receive. So
Right.
someone's not going to just walk around self-gaslighting themselves unless at some point in their life their emotions were minimized, disregarded, or degraded. And so the same thing, I mean, when it comes to women and the Me Too movement and this whole, really saying what's going on, it's weird. I think about being where I'm at in my life and what I've seen, how much I've seen change in what I even expected as far as this goes. Like, I remember being taught to put keys between my fingers,
Right.
right? And that's just something you do. Right? But it shouldn't just be something you do. That's not okay. And for us to make it normal is a byproduct of really effective societal gaslighting.
I couldn't agree more. It's so devastating as well because you see those videos on memes on Instagram and stuff where there are women are taught all these things, right? Don't walk
Mhm.
down dark alley. You shouldn't wear that. You should put those
Mhm.
keys between your fingers. All of these things. What did you do to him?
Right. And if you think of, I mean, we're obviously not for us to say our personal experience, but there are so many stories about like women and men of color and like little black boys and all of these things like the messaging that they're given that they're taught to keep themselves safe, and that shouldn't be the case either. Just like we shouldn't have to put keys between our fingers, they shouldn't have to be so very cautious either, and it's
Yeah.
all again byproduct of sustaining messaging that needs to change.
It's really just another form of oppression, isn't it? How can we keep them
Yes.
down? How can we just
Mhm.
push you down and make you know your place? You know?
I mean, you just hit the nail on the head. The purpose of gaslighting is oppression. And this is why it's so important to have these conversations. Can identify that it's happening. Know that it's happening. Because if you think of it this way, gaslighting cannot exist when you know it's happening. Like, you cannot by theory, you cannot gaslight me if I know you are gaslighting me. So that's why it's really important to have these conversations and to know what it is and what it's not, so it doesn't get misused, so it doesn't lose its power when you identify it.
Right. And we might realize years later and then reflect, unpack, and go, okay, next time it happens, I'm gonna know
Right.
now. I always
Right.
think in my mind, I'm always like shine a light on it. When you
Mm.
shine a light on anything, it kind of dissolves in the light. What I mean by that is that, you can unravel it and then know for next time. All right. So what if someone's listening to this episode and they're like, oh my gosh, like I am in an abusive relationship where I'm
Mhm.
consistently gaslit. What would you say to them?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry, and I'm happy you're here, and I'm happy you're listening, and I'm happy you're questioning whether or not this is happening. That's step number 1. Identifying, as I was saying, identifying what is happening. Number 2, I think I mentioned earlier, reaching out to someone, anyone, even if it's a coworker about something that's happening on the job, a therapist, friend, family. I mean, I don't want to minimize, but even journaling to yourself, like if you don't feel like there's someone that you want to go to, just taking that moment to step back and have that conversation about it. The next part is distance. Anything you can do to create space between you and the gaslighter. And that's going to look so different for so many people. Sometimes it looks like ending a relationship, quitting a job, getting a new doctor. That's not always so easy, though. And I
Mhm.
understand that. And so, any distance that you can accomplish is going to be powerful. I'd given the example earlier, if you are a child and you're being gaslit by your parent, that is incredibly difficult to create distance. You usually can't just walk out.
Right.
So, I remember working with a teenager who was definitely being gaslit by her parents. She was 17, almost out of the house. And we had a very frank conversation. We can't save you from this gaslighting that's happening with them, but let's create a plan to get you the most independence that you can accomplish so that you can sustain your sense of self. And
Mm.
that leads into the next step, really doing things to reorient yourself with yourself. So, again, whether that's getting more connected with things that you enjoy, or just even self care in general. Because if you're constantly trying to question whether or not you are going crazy, it is very common that you are also going to be foregoing self care. And the more you fortify yourself and you feel strong within yourself, the easier it'll be to feel when something's off. I kind of think of that example of if you take lactose out of your diet, for instance, and I never knew. I just took it out. I just thought it was a good idea. And then suddenly you have a piece of pizza and you're ill. And you're thinking, I used to be able to eat pizza all the time. What's going on? Well, your body has recovered. It now knows what it should and shouldn't put in itself. And so you put that in you and your body reacts. The same thing happens for us an emotional energetic level when you really strengthen that self-care as much as you can. And I know that's different for everyone. You will feel the off feeling that gaslighting can make you feel a lot easier. And then finally, sometimes you have to report it. I mean, and that's why I was saying fact tracking, keeping track of things. And this can come out in if, say, you're trying to make change on a job, or let's say you're breaking up with someone and you're in a legal situation. Sometimes you do need facts and information to back up your experience. And that's not the case for everyone, but that's for some folks.
I think we've already kind of touched on this. What are the stages of gaslighting?
It depends on the situation and the relationship, but it's very common. You're not going to have it's kind of like love bombing if you think about it. You're going to want to a love bomber, for anyone who has not heard love bombing, when you're just being showered with affection and adoration and attention in order to hook you into a relationship and have you rely on the other person.
Mhm.
And it can look different than early infatuation because of the speed, the intensity, and there's usually not a reciprocity. It can feel very imbalanced with love
Mhm.
bombing. But hypothetically speaking, once love bombed, you will be a bit more likely to experience gaslighting because now the love bomber, the manipulator knows that they've got you. At least they hope they've got you. And at that stage, it's not uncommon for the gaslighter to start sprinkling in inaccuracies. So it's going to be very a slow boil at first to see what they can get away with. And that's why pinpointing when gaslighting is happening and addressing it as early as possible is the most powerful way to address it. And you don't always have to say, "You're gaslighting me." Ideally, it'd be great. But if you're not in that dynamic where you feel comfortable using that term, you can say something along the lines of, I hear you, but I know my reality, right? And you're not getting into a power struggle. You're setting a firm boundary of what you know to be true. From there, if they do get away with the early sprinklings of inaccuracy, they will start to double down and they are going to start to be more obvious forms. And then from there, there's going to be, as I was mentioning, the isolation piece where they really want you to rely on them from their repetitions. So the thing about gaslighting, it's very important that the behavior be repeated often enough to really break down your, as we've been speaking about, your inner sense of self and your ego and that strength you have within yourself. And the thing of it is that this can stop and start at any of these stages, but sometimes it will escalate to dangerous forms of gaslighting where, I mean, I think it's like Munchausen syndrome. I always mispronounce that. Where have you heard of that before?
I think, is that the woman who killed her mother recently? She was gaslit for years.
Right. So her mother had inflicted that. So it's
Mm.
basically where you are gaslit into thinking that you're sick when you're not, and usually by a caretaker or someone who has power over you. So you can see how, if left unaddressed, gaslighting can escalate to much more dangerous stages
Mhm.
where your safety or your children's safety can be, and I'm saying children just this is an example of having a unit that you're responsible for.
Right.
Those folks can also be at risk if something doesn't stop along the way.
Wow, this is I think there's gonna be a lot of epiphanies listening to this because it's, I don't know, I hear it so often used, and I think by people misusing the word, it kind of takes away the power of like how intense this actually is, and because it really can alter people's realities. And when you don't trust your own mind, that's a really problematic place to be.
It's scary. It genuinely feels scary. And it can be especially difficult if the person who's making you feel that way is someone that you think you can trust or someone that you feel love towards. It can be very confusing.
Well, Dr. Amelia, this has been incredible. Is there anything that you think that is important that we haven't touched on yet?
I think one thing I do just want to kind of put out there is that because we are women, I think that it makes sense that we can really relate, and we've talked a lot and kind of unpacked a lot of that. But there's so much to societal gaslighting, systemic, racial gaslighting, all that, that I don't think we can do honor to. And I
Right.
think it's important to really point that out, that this is a much bigger conversation that needs to continue.
Okay. Well, tell us a little bit about your book. And also, if people want to get in touch with you and work with you, how can they do that?
Okay, so I have my book right here. It's right here. Gaslighting Recovery for Women: The Complete Guide to Recognizing Manipulation and Achieving Freedom from Emotional Abuse. It is a mouthful. And you can get it anywhere books are sold: Amazon, Target, Walmart, Barnes and Noble, anywhere. And you can find out more about this book. And I actually have a couple more coming out this year. And so if you want to keep up with me and my writing, and just really, I love to share knowledge that I learn with folks and my clients. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Amelia Kelley, and that's Kelly with an EY. And also my website, ameliakelly.com. I've got, links to different articles. And then I also have a blog on Psychology Today called In Your Corner. And I try to unpack everything from gaslighting and relationship conflicts, but also I do a lot of focus on neurodiversity and empowering those with ADHD and high sensitivity, especially after they've undergone trauma. So yeah, I'd love to hear from your listeners and answer any questions they might have.
Amazing. And I highly recommend that book. Did not get my physical copy yet, but I have got
I
my,
know.
I have got an electronic copy. Dr. Amelia, thank you so much for being here. This has been such an important conversation, and I appreciate your input so much. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
This podcast is a Rebel Love production. To find the links mentioned in this episode, go to rebellove.com/let love begin.